The Chamber Orchestra of New York mostly performs a style of music called classical music. I'm sure most of you have heard this music before. The big question we need to ask ourselves is, what is classical music? Well, what do you think classical music is? It's actually not an easy question to answer. Let's take a look at some of the characteristics of classical music. The first characteristic of classical music is that the music originated in Europe from hundreds of years ago. Here's a map of the world. Here is Europe, and there is the United States. Classical music originally came from countries in Europe, such as Italy, Germany, Austria, Spain, France, and England. Of course, there was so much amazing music in other countries around the world, but we don't call that music classical music. You might know the names of famous people who wrote classical music like Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven. We call these people composers. The second characteristic of classical music is that it is written by a composer. A composer is a person who writes classical music. Even though there are many other types of music from around the world, most examples are not written down. The third characteristic of classical music is that the music is notated in a score for musicians to read. A score is the notation or written music that musicians read. You'll notice the musician in this picture is carefully reading the score to know which pitches, rhythm, and dynamics to play. The fourth characteristic of classical music is that the musicians spend many years learning difficult techniques on their instruments. They also have to learn how to read complicated music notation. Some common instruments played by classical musicians are violin, trumpet, flute, and piano. The fifth characteristic of classical music is that it often has a conductor when many musicians are playing at the same time. A conductor is the director of an orchestra, choir, or other performing group. Here's a question that many people ask. Do musicians need a conductor if they are all reading the same music? Do they really need a person to direct them? And that's a great question. The answer is yes and no. A large group of musicians can play without a conductor. However, they will find it difficult to play the same tempo and dynamics. They also might have a hard time agreeing on the overall sound of the music. One of the many jobs of a conductor is to show the tempo and dynamics with their hands. They often use a baton as well to make their movements more clear. Watch this example of Salvatore Di Vittorio as he conducts the Chamber Orchestra of New York. Now I have one last question for you. Do you think classical music was only written by people a long time ago? Well, I'm happy to report the answer is no. There are many classical composers who are still writing incredible music today, and they come from all around the world. In fact, the conductor of our orchestra, Salvatore Di Vittorio, is a composer, and I'm a composer as well. And it's our hope that one day maybe you will also become a composer.